McQuistion for over 28 years, talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McQuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumners Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. Moss Adams LLP, certified public accountants and consultants, providing industry-smart tax, assurance, and consulting solutions to help businesses and their owners succeed since 1913. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Robert Hall is my guest today. He's appeared on our program before. He's the author of many articles, and his latest book is This Land of Strangers. He's also a recovering CEO and an executive coach, but his real passion is helping people build strong, positive relationships. Today we're going to talk about an article that you wrote last year entitled The New Religion, Destructive Escalation. So let's start with what destructive escalation is. Robert, what is it?
Well, I think we all are concerned about the level of differences and animus that we experience today. My biggest concern, we've always had differences. Differences are healthy, but destructive escalation, in my opinion now, is a new level of response to conflict and differences that seems to almost invariably result in whatever conflict we have, each party then escalates it. And whether they do that purposely or whether they do that accidentally, the effect is there's been an escalation that I think is very destructive that, then kind of flows throughout our society. It's tough on relationships. It's tough in politics. It's tough in faith. It's tough at the workforce. It's tough at the Thanksgiving lunch table when we're together with family. So that escalation, I think, is really significant. And I think there's a number of reasons for it, but at the kind of the main thing that we're dealing with is the unintended consequences of things that are great advancements in our society.
Exactly. And this thing, I think you said it was a psychological concept, which is why that viewer may or may not have heard of it. I hadn't heard of it before myself, I hate to tell you that, but you said that there are basically 5 steps in this thing. And so if we could look at graphic number 2, these are the 5 steps of destructive escalation. So we won't keep that graphic up there the whole time, but I'll just read them and then I'll let you sort of talk through them. So retaliate, stereotype, disassociate, polarize, and violate. So let's start with retaliate. How does that work?
Well, first of all, anytime we're confronted with someone we don't like, we feel attacked, whatever, it's not new. It goes back to biblical times. The tendency is to retaliate. The unfortunate thing that happens when we retaliate, though, is the research shows, they've done this in labs, that we really don't try to retaliate to get even. We really retaliate to try to get just a little bit ahead. And so the first thing that happens is we respond, and we have a choice of things that would de-escalate or escalate. And retaliation typically escalates. So that's the first thing that happens.
Yeah, well, if that wasn't bad enough, because I guess you could re-retaliate or whatever.
Exactly.
But it goes downhill from there to the next one is called stereotyping. We hear a lot about stereotypes these days. Well, you're stereotyping me or you're whatever. What does that mean in this context?
Certainly retaliation, as we deal with people we either are wounded by or don't like or in conflict with, there's a tendency to look at them and then say, there's a whole group of people and they are all just like this person that I've netted out to 2 or 3 traits that I don't care for. So we generalize to groups of people who are often very different, and we put them all together as if they are all exactly the same.
And from a political standpoint, how would that play out? What would somebody say? You're a what?
Well, you're a leftist, you're right wing, you're alt-right, you're an extremist. And so it may be political kinds of things. It also may be religion. You're you're a radical atheist, you're a radical Islamist, you're whatever. And so when we begin to stereotype, rather than dealing with the differences that each person has, they all get lumped together.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And then we go from that to disassociate. What does that mean?
So the first two things that happen, we retaliate to the others, we then stereotype them, and then we decide to move away from them. And in disassociation, what we decide is that other side that's all the same, monolithic, is so bad that I can't interact with them anymore. And obviously, when we disassociate, then we no longer get to see the differences. The stereotyping that we've done then gets locked in.
Yeah, and so this happens other than just in politics as well, you say?
Sure. You know, when we look at stereotyping others and then totally separating, we find today, particularly in urban areas, we can choose where we live, we can choose what church we go to, we often choose where we work, and we're then looking for people that are like us to help us disassociate from those that are different from us. We begin to cluster.
In your book on This Land of Strangers, you talk about relationships all the time and one of the challenges. So before we go to these other two, give that viewer some idea of the challenges that you talked about in that book, and then how, in particular, these three things work against the whole issue of relationships.
You know, if the world were perfect today, I think we would say that relationships are our single most valuable and value-creating resource. It is out of relationships that new products are created, that families are formed, that businesses form, that social groups come together. If you've read the book Sapien, you know that the anthropologist wrote that book, said, why did people evolve and not any other creatures? And he said, we learned to cooperate. So our ability to work together and be productive individually and as a society is a huge source of wealth and well-being and health. And so putting relationship at the top of the food chain allows us to reap those benefits. There's always been war. There's always been different disagreements. That's not new. Destructive escalation, I fear, though, has changed from what we've known, because we've always tended to retaliate. We've always tended to stereotype. We've always disassociated. But it is that fourth step, polarization, that I think has really changed the game to create really destructive escalation. And there's several things that I think that enable that. First of all, when you look at polarization, what you find is that we begin to associate with other people like us in our tribe. And often now, leaders who want to head up that tribe in polarization compete for each other who can be the most radical or extreme, because usually leadership accrues in a homogeneous group to whoever's most radical. There's great research that's been done for a long period of time, is that when homogeneous groups deliberate, the hypothesis of that original research is that they would moderate, but they don't. They become more radical. When you put a group of people together who are very similar and you have leaders emerge, they tend to become more radical or more polar. That's then compounded by two other things. So we have leaders vying to be the most radical. We have a media today that rewards whoever says the most outlandish things, because that grabs eyeballs and that pays the bills. And we certainly have media today that has exemplified that. And then we have technology today that allows us, through social media and related kinds of things, related kinds of technology, to say outlandish things that then get us attention